Picture this. You're standing in front of a mirror in complete darkness, and suddenly a face appears in the reflection that isn't yours. It's twisted, angry, everything you've tried to hide about yourself staring back with knowing eyes. This isn't a nightmare. This is what Carl Jung called our most powerful and dangerous psychological reality. The question that will haunt you tonight is this: what if I told you that this dark reflection is actually controlling every major decision you make, every relationship you destroy, every dream you abandon? By the end of this journey into the deepest chambers of the human psyche, you'll discover Jung's most revolutionary insight about the shadow self, and how recognizing it might be the key to finally breaking free from the invisible chains that have been shaping your destiny. Carl Gustav Jung understood something about human nature that most of us spend our entire lives running from. Born in 1875 in Switzerland, Jung wasn't just observing the human mind from a clinical distance. He was diving headfirst into the abyss of his own unconscious, mapping territories of the psyche that had never been explored before. What he found there would change psychology forever, but more importantly, it would reveal why we keep making the same mistakes, why we're drawn to the same toxic patterns, and why our greatest enemy might be the part of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. Jung's journey into the shadow began with his own psychological breakdown. In 1913, at the age of 38, this successful psychiatrist found himself plunging into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For 6 years, he experienced visions, heard voices, and encountered figures from his dreams in waking life. Most people would have considered this madness, but Jung saw it as the most important research of his career. He was descending into his own shadow, and what he discovered there would revolutionize our understanding of human psychology. But let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. When was the last time you did something that completely contradicted your values? When did you last find yourself saying something cruel to someone you love, or making a decision that you knew was wrong but felt compelled to make anyway? That wasn't weakness. That wasn't a moment of poor judgment. That was your shadow taking control. Jung defined the shadow as the part of our personality that we've rejected, denied, or hidden from ourselves and others. It's everything we don't want to be, everything we've been taught is unacceptable, everything that doesn't fit the image we've constructed of ourselves. But here's where it gets terrifying. The shadow doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. Instead, it grows stronger in the darkness, influencing our behavior in ways we don't even recognize. Think about the last time you had an intense, irrational reaction to someone. Maybe it was road rage, maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was a moment of unexpected cruelty. Jung would tell you that your reaction wasn't really about the other person at all. It was your shadow recognizing itself in someone else and responding with the fury of the denied self. We despise in others what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. This is what Jung called projection, and it's happening in your life right now, whether you realize it or not. The traits that trigger you most intensely in other people are often the very qualities your shadow possesses. The arrogant co-worker who makes your blood boil, your shadow might be revealing your own denied arrogance. The selfish friend who drives you crazy, your shadow might be showing you your own repressed selfishness, but the shadow's influence goes far deeper than momentary reactions. It shapes our relationships, our career choices, our entire life trajectory. Jung observed that people often marry their shadow. They're unconsciously drawn to partners who embody the traits they've denied in themselves. The controlled person falls for the wild one. The people-pleaser is attracted to the selfish one. The intellectual dismisses emotion, but is magnetized by the dramatic one. We think we're choosing based on attraction, but we're actually being pulled by the gravitational force of our own denied aspects. And here's something that might disturb you. Your shadow has been making decisions for you your entire life, and you probably don't even know it. Every time you've sabotaged a good relationship, every time you've turned down an opportunity that scared you, every time you've acted in ways that contradicted your conscious values, that was your shadow asserting its power. It operates in the spaces between your thoughts, in the moments when you're not paying attention, in the decisions that seem to make themselves. Jung discovered that the shadow isn't just personal, it's also collective. We inherit shadow qualities from our families, our cultures, our entire species. The shadow contains not just our individual repressions, but the dark history of humanity itself. This is why certain symbols, certain archetypes, certain fears seem to be universal. The monster in the closet, the demon in the night, the evil twin, these aren't just random fears. They're acknowledgements of the shadow that lives within every human being. Consider your dreams for a moment. Jung spent decades analyzing dreams, and he noticed that the shadow often appears as a same-sex figure of the same approximate age who embodies everything the dreamer rejects about themselves. This dream figure might be aggressive when the dreamer is passive, sexual when the dreamer is repressed, or weak when the dreamer prides themselves on strength. These aren't random dream characters, they're messengers from your unconscious, trying to show you the parts of yourself you need to integrate. But integration, that's the key word Jung used. He didn't believe the goal was to eliminate the shadow, because that's impossible. The shadow contains not just our negative qualities, but also our undeveloped potential, our creative power, our authentic emotions. When we reject the shadow completely, we also reject our vitality, our passion, our full humanity. Jung called this process of integrating the shadow individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole, authentic person. The path to individuation requires what Jung called shadow work, the difficult process of acknowledging, accepting, and integrating the parts of ourselves we'd rather deny. This isn't about becoming a worse person. It's about becoming a complete person. When we own our shadow, it stops owning us. When we acknowledge our capacity for anger, we can choose how to express it constructively. When we admit our selfish impulses, we can make conscious choices about when to prioritize ourselves and when to sacrifice for others. Jung believed that most of our suffering comes from the war between our conscious self and our shadow self. We exhaust ourselves trying to maintain an image that excludes half of who we are. We make decisions based on who we think we should be, rather than who we actually are. We attract people and situations that force us to confront our shadow in painful ways, because the unconscious is always trying to achieve balance. But what does shadow work actually look like in practice? Jung suggested several approaches. First, pay attention to your projections. When someone triggers an intense emotional response in you, ask yourself, what quality in this person am I refusing to see in myself? Second, examine your dreams. Your shadow often appears as threatening or unpleasant dream figures. Instead of dismissing these dreams as nightmares, consider what these figures might be trying to tell you about your rejected aspects. Third, notice your slips of the tongue, your accidental behaviors, the things you do when you're tired or stressed. These are often moments when the shadow breaks through. Fourth, look at the qualities you most pride yourself on and consider their opposites. If you're extremely organized, your shadow might contain chaos. If you're always helpful, your shadow might contain selfishness. The goal isn't to become disorganized or selfish, but to acknowledge these capacities exist within you. The most profound part of Jung's teaching about the shadow is that it contains not just our darkness, but our unlived life. Every choice we make closes off other possibilities, and those unlived possibilities don't disappear. They go into the shadow. The artist who became a banker carries the artist in their shadow. The adventurer who chose security carries the risk-taker in their shadow. The leader who learned to follow carries the authority in their shadow. This is why midlife crises are so common and so intense. By middle age, the shadow has accumulated decades of unlived possibilities, rejected aspects, and denied authenticity. The crisis isn't really about getting older, it's about the shadow demanding recognition. People suddenly leave marriages, change careers, or make radical life changes, not because they've lost their minds, but because their shadows are finally breaking through decades of repression. Jung's own midlife confrontation with his unconscious taught him that the shadow isn't the enemy, it's the guide to our authentic self. When he stopped fighting his visions and started engaging with them, when he stopped trying to maintain his professional image and started exploring his psychological depths, he didn't become a madman. He became more himself than he had ever been before. The shadow also explains why we're so fascinated by villains in stories, why we're drawn to dark themes in art and literature, why we can't look away from scandals and tragedies. We're not sick or twisted. We're unconsciously seeking connection with our own shadow through these external representations. The villain in the movie represents the villain in ourselves that we've never acknowledged. The tragic hero represents our own capacity for self-destruction. But Jung discovered something even more profound. When we integrate our shadow, we don't become darker people. We become more compassionate, more creative, more alive. This seems contradictory, but it makes perfect sense. When you acknowledge your own capacity for jealousy, you become less judgmental of jealous people. When you own your selfish impulses, you can choose generosity from a place of wholeness rather than denial. When you admit your fears, you can act courageously with full awareness of what you're overcoming. The person who has never acknowledged their shadow is dangerous because they can't see their destructive potential. They can hurt others while maintaining their self-image as a good person. But the person who has done shadow work understands their capacity for both creation and destruction, and they can make conscious choices about which to express. Jung also noticed that the shadow often contains our greatest gifts. The qualities we're most ashamed of are often distorted versions of our greatest strengths. The person ashamed of their anger might discover they have a powerful capacity for justice. The person ashamed of their neediness might discover they have an extraordinary capacity for love. The person ashamed of their darkness might discover they have an unusual capacity for seeing truth. This brings us to what might be the most important insight Jung ever had about the shadow, and this is the revelation I promised you at the beginning. After decades of psychological research, after his own journey into the unconscious, after analyzing thousands of dreams and working with countless patients, Jung concluded this: the shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It runs your life when you ignore it. But when you turn toward your shadow with courage and curiosity, when you acknowledge it as part of your complete humanity, something miraculous happens. The energy you've been using to repress and hide and maintain your false image becomes available for living your authentic life. The shadow holds the key to your individual power because it contains everything you've rejected about yourself, including your rejected strengths, your unlived potential, your authentic emotions, your creative fire. When you integrate your shadow, you don't become a worse person. You become a whole person, and whole people are the ones who change the world, create beauty, love deeply, and live without the exhausting burden of maintaining a false self. The invisible chains that have been controlling your destiny aren't external circumstances or other people or even your conscious fears. They're the parts of yourself you've been running from. The shadow is both the chain and the key to your freedom. When you stop running from your darkness, you stop being controlled by it. When you acknowledge your capacity for selfishness, you can choose genuine generosity. When you own your anger, you can access your power. When you admit your fears, you can act with courage. Jung's message is both challenging and liberating. You are not who you think you are. You are far more complex, far more capable, far more powerful than your conscious mind knows. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's your teacher, your guide to wholeness, your path to authentic living. The person you could become is waiting in the darkness you've been avoiding. The subconscious chains that control your destiny are made of rejected self-knowledge. But knowledge, even dark knowledge, is power. And power, consciously wielded, is freedom. Your shadow is not your enemy. It's your unexplored territory, your hidden strength, your path to becoming who you really are. The journey into your shadow isn't comfortable, but it's the most important journey you'll ever take. Because on the other side of that darkness lies not destruction, but integration. Not madness, but wholeness. Not the end of who you are, but the beginning of who you could become. If this exploration into Jung's revolutionary insights about the shadow has stirred something in you, if you're ready to begin your own journey towards psychological wholeness, then subscribe to continue this exploration. Share this video with someone who might be ready to confront their own shadow. And let me know in the comments, what aspect of your shadow are you most afraid to acknowledge? Next week, we'll dive deeper into Jung's process of individuation and discover how dreams can become your personal guide to integration. The unconscious is always speaking. We just need to learn how to listen. Your shadow is waiting, and your authentic self is on the other side of that conversation.